The rain in Normandy during the month of June in 1944 did not fall with the grace of a summer shower, but rather arrived as a relentless gray shroud that turned the fertile soil of France into a thick, soul-sucking mire. For the men of the United States Army, the hedgerows were not simple fences, but ancient fortifications made of stone and tangled root systems that turned every field into a killing jar, where the German defenders had registered every square inch for their mortars. In the middle of this green labyrinth, a small medical detachment of the United States 3rd Armored Division found itself lost in the fog of war, moving through a narrow lane near the village of St. Lo. The stench of rotting cattle and cordite hung heavy in the humid air as the lumbering Dodge ambulances struggled to maintain traction on the slick mud, while the distant thunder of 88mm guns vibrated through the very marrow of their bones. Lieutenant Sarah Miller sat in the back of the lead vehicle, her hands stained with the dried copper-colored blood of the boys she had spent the last 48 hours trying to stitch back together. She was 24 years old, but in the light of the flickering kerosene lamp, she looked like she had aged a decade since her boots first hit the sand of Omaha Beach. Her world was a claustrophobic space, filled with the smell of ether and the low moans of wounded men, until the world suddenly exploded into a cacophony of shattering glass and the terrifying rhythmic thud of a Maschinengewehr 42. The ambush was over in a matter of seconds, leaving the medical convoy a smoldering wreck of twisted metal and torn canvas. The German paratroopers and SS grenadiers emerged from the dense foliage, like ghosts of the forest, their camouflage smocks blending perfectly with the shadows of the bocage. Sarah felt the cold bite of the morning air as she was dragged from the ambulance, her knees hitting the wet gravel of the road, while the screams of her fellow medics were silenced by the harsh commands of the conquerors. Standing over her was a man who seemed to embody the very essence of the Third Reich, a Sturmbannführer of the Waffen-SS, whose black uniform was torn and soaked in blood, but whose eyes still burned with a fanatical and poisonous intensity. His name was Dietrich von Schrader, a man known for his brutality on the Eastern Front, now brought low by a piece of American shrapnel that had embedded itself deep within his thigh and abdomen. He was a high-ranking officer of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, and even in his wounded state, he carried himself with an arrogance that suggested he viewed the Americans not as soldiers, but as a temporary inconvenience to be crushed under his heel. The SS soldiers forced Sarah toward a makeshift command post in the cellar of a bombed-out farmhouse, where the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the metallic tang of fresh blood. The Sturmbannführer was laid out on a rough wooden table, his breathing ragged and shallow as the internal hemorrhaging began to take its toll on his massive frame. He looked up at Sarah, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred and physical agony, as he realized that his life now depended on the hands of a woman wearing the uniform of the United States Army. With a trembling hand, he reached for the holster at his side and drew his Walther P-38 pistol, pressing the cold steel of the barrel against Sarah's temple with a force that bruised her skin. The soldiers around him watched in silence, their fingers twitching on the triggers of their MP-40 submachine guns, as their commander began to speak in a voice that was a guttural rasp of broken English and German. He called her a subhuman, a creature of the lower orders who existed only to serve the master race, and he demanded that she stop the pain immediately, or he would paint the walls of the cellar with her brains. To him, she was nothing more than a walking medical tool, a biological machine to be used and discarded once her function was complete. He leaned forward and spat a thick glob of bloody phlegm onto the white cross of her medical tunic, a gesture of ultimate contempt that signaled his belief that she was unworthy of even the most basic human dignity. Sarah Miller stood perfectly still, the weight of the pistol against her head, a constant reminder of her proximity to the void. Yet her mind began to sharpen with a clarity she had never known in the operating rooms of London or the field hospitals of the beachhead. She looked into the eyes of the man who had murdered her friends and insulted her existence, and she saw not a god or a conqueror, but a biological organism that was failing. The Sturmbannführer was demanding relief from the agonizing fire that was consuming his nervous system, and he was too blinded by his own ideology to realize that he was handing his life to the very person he had just dehumanized. Sarah began to unpack her medical kit with deliberate and steady movements, her fingers dancing over the glass vials and the steel needles that represented the cutting edge of 1944 pharmacology. She knew the mechanics of the human body better than the officer, knew the internal workings of a Tiger tank, and she understood that the line between a life-saving treatment and a lethal strike was measured in milligrams and cubic centimeters. This was the beginning of her silent war, a heresy against the Hippocratic Oath, born from the realization that some monsters did not deserve the mercy of the medicine they demanded. The technical reality of the Sturmbannführer's condition was a complex puzzle of trauma and physiological stress that required more than just a simple bandage or a splash of antiseptic. The shrapnel from the American mortar round had shredded the femoral artery and punctured the lower intestinal tract, leading to a slow and agonizing leakage of waste into the abdominal cavity, known as peritonitis. Under normal circumstances, the protocol would involve a massive transfusion of plasma, followed by hours of meticulous surgery to debride the wound and repair the vascular damage. But in the damp darkness of a French cellar, such luxuries did not exist. Sarah looked at the officer's chart, if such a thing could be said to exist in his mind, and she calculated the rate of his pulse, which was hammering at over 140 beats per minute. His body was already in the early stages of hypovolemic shock, a state where the heart compensates for the loss of blood by pumping faster and harder until the entire system eventually collapses under the strain. The pain he was experiencing was a direct result of the inflammatory response triggered by the bacterial infection spreading through his gut, a fire that no amount of willpower could extinguish. She reached for the morphine syrettes, which were the standard issue pain relief for the Allied forces, each one containing a pre-measured dose of half a grain of morphine tartrate. Morphine is a powerful opiate derived from the Papaver somniferum, or the opium poppy, and its primary mechanism of action is to bind with the mu-opioid receptors in the central nervous system. When these receptors are activated, they inhibit the release of neurotransmitters, such as substance P and glutamate, which are responsible for transmitting pain signals from the peripheral nerves to the brain. However, morphine is also a potent respiratory depressant because it acts directly on the brainstem to reduce the sensitivity of the respiratory center to carbon dioxide levels in the blood. In a healthy individual, a standard dose would provide euphoria and a profound numbness to physical suffering. But in a patient already suffering from severe blood loss and respiratory distress, the balance becomes incredibly precarious. Sarah knew that by administering a high concentration of the drug, she could suppress the officer's autonomic drive to breathe effectively, tricking his brain into forgetting how to draw air into his lungs. As she prepared the first injection, the Sturmbannführer watched her with a predatory gaze, his finger still resting on the trigger of his pistol, as if he could sense the deadly intent hidden behind her professional facade. Sarah began to speak to him in a low and soothing tone, the voice of a caregiver meant to disarm the instincts of a wounded animal, while she secretly dialed in the parameters of his execution. She explained the process of the medication in simple terms, telling him that the cold sensation he would feel in his veins was the medicine working its way toward his heart to bring him the peace he so desperately sought. She was describing the pharmacological process of distribution and metabolism, where the morphine would be carried by the remaining plasma through the vena cava and into the right atrium of the heart before being pumped out to the rest of the body. The officer nodded his head, his grip on the pistol loosening slightly as the first wave of the opiate began to cross the blood-brain barrier, a process that usually takes only a few minutes, but feels like an eternity to the person in agony. Sarah was not just a nurse in that moment. She was an engineer of mortality, working within the constraints of a hostile environment to achieve a result that the Allied Air Force had failed to deliver. She watched the dilation of his pupils, a classic sign of opioid effect, and she monitored the rhythm of his chest as his breathing shifted from the rapid gasping of a panicked man to a slow and rhythmic cadence that was deceptively calm. She knew that the lethal dose for a man of his size, especially in his weakened state, was far lower than what a healthy soldier could withstand. And she began to prepare the second and third syrettes under the guise of ensuring his long-term stability. The SS soldiers in the room were distracted by the sound of American artillery moving closer, the distant crump of 105mm shells shaking the dust from the rafters of the farmhouse and providing the perfect sonic cover for her actions. They saw only a dedicated nurse performing her duty to a superior officer, while in reality, they were witnessing the precise and calculated dismantling of a war machine by a woman who had been told she was nothing. The Sturmbannführer began to drift into a state of profound sedation, his eyes rolling back in his head as the world around him faded into a blissful haze of gray and gold. He no longer felt the fire in his leg or the cold dampness of the cellar. Instead, he felt as though he were floating on a warm sea, far away from the mud and the death of the Western Front. He tried to speak one last time, to utter another insult or a command to his men, but the muscles in his throat had become as heavy as lead, and his tongue refused to move. Sarah leaned in close to his ear, her voice a sharp contrast to the gentle mask she had worn only moments before, as she whispered the names of the medics he had slaughtered, and the boys who would never go home because of the division he led. She watched as the realization flickered for a brief second in his fading consciousness, a spark of terror that was quickly extinguished by the overwhelming tide of the morphine. His heart rate began to drop, 60 beats per minute, then 40, then 20, as the electrical impulses from the sinoatrial node were smothered by the chemical saturation of his system. The end came not with a bang or a heroic final stand, but with a long and silent exhale that seemed to carry the very soul of the officer out into the damp French air. Sarah Miller stood back and watched as the light left his eyes, her face a blank canvas that hid the storm of emotions swirling within her chest. She had committed an act that would be seen by some as a violation of her sacred duty, and by others as a necessary blow in a total war. But in the cold reality of that 1944 morning, it was simply justice. The SS soldiers, realizing their leader was dead, began to panic, their discipline fraying as the sounds of the approaching United States infantry grew louder and the first American grenades began to clear the hedgerows outside. Sarah reached down and picked up the Walther P-38 that had fallen from the officer's lifeless hand, feeling the weight of the metal and the history it represented. She was no longer just a prisoner or a tool of the Reich. She was a survivor who had looked into the abyss and found the strength to push back. The battle for Normandy was far from over, but in this one small cellar, the balance of power had shifted, and the nurse had become the most dangerous person in the room. The science of the kill was something Sarah would have to carry with her for the rest of her life, a secret burden that would never appear in the official reports of the 3rd Armored Division or the medical journals of the era. She understood that what she had done was a form of chemical warfare conducted at the molecular level, where the weapon was a liquid and the battlefield was the human bloodstream. As she moved toward the exit of the farmhouse, stepping over the bodies of the fallen and the debris of a broken world, she looked back at the table where the Sturmbannführer lay. He was a monument to a fallen ideology, a man who believed in the superiority of blood and iron, but who had been defeated by a simple nurse with a syringe and a knowledge of the human heart. The rain continued to fall, washing away the spit from her tunic and the blood from her hands, but the memory of the lethal dose would remain forever etched in the history of the hidden wars fought in the shadows of the Great Crusade. The thunder of the American advance finally shattered the heavy silence of the farmhouse cellar as the rhythmic pounding of the Browning WW2 heavy machine guns began to tear through the stone walls above. Sarah Miller stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the cooling corpses of the master race, her hands still trembling from the chemical execution she had just performed. The crucible of her ordeal wasn't over, but had merely shifted from the threat of the pistol to the chaotic uncertainty of friendly fire. As the first sticks of white phosphorus grenades began to bloom like deadly flowers in the courtyard, the air in the basement became a thick soup of dust and limestone particles. She heard the frantic shouts of the GIs belonging to the 9th Infantry Division, their voices high and tight with the adrenaline of the assault. They did not know that an American nurse was trapped within the target zone, and Sarah realized that the very men coming to save her were currently the greatest threat to her survival. She ducked behind the heavy oak table where the Sturmbannführer lay, his face now a peaceful mask that belied the darkness of his soul. The technical reality of an urban assault in 1944 was one of indiscriminate destruction, where every window was a potential sniper nest and every door a booby trap. When the lead squad finally kicked in the cellar door, the light from their flashlights cut through the gloom like searchlights over London. They found Sarah standing over the high-ranking German officer, her uniform soaked in a mixture of his blood and the mud of the bocage. The sergeant in charge, a battle-hardened man from Pennsylvania named Miller, looked at the scene with a mixture of confusion and professional suspicion. He saw the empty morphine syringes on the floor and the silent form of the SS commander, and he saw the Walther P-38 in Sarah's hand. In the heat of the front line, there was little room for nuance, and for a moment, the barrels of 8 M1 Garand rifles were trained on her chest. The skepticism of her own side was a different kind of fire, one that burned with the coldness of bureaucracy and the inherent bias of the era. They questioned how a lone nurse had managed to survive an ambush that had wiped out a medical convoy, and they looked at the dead officer with the eyes of men who had seen too many tricks and too many collaborators. Sarah had to explain the mechanics of her survival, while the farmhouse groaned under the weight of incoming 88mm shells from the retreating German rearguard. The transition from prisoner to survivor was a jagged and painful process, as Sarah was moved back through the lines to a rear area medical clearing station near Sainte-Mère-Église. She was no longer just a nurse, but a person of interest, subject to debriefings by the Counterintelligence Corps, who wanted to know every detail of what the Sturmbannführer had said before he died. They were looking for tactical intelligence on the movements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, while Sarah was trying to process the fact that she had used her healing arts to take a life. The crucible of the interrogation rooms was a sterile and gray environment, where the smells of coffee and stale cigarettes replaced the stench of the cellar. The officers who questioned her were men of logic and maps who did not understand the visceral reality of the insult she had endured, or the cold precision of the overdose she had administered. They saw the death of the SS officer as a missed opportunity for intelligence, while Sarah saw it as a necessary act of sterilization. She spoke of the milligrams and the respiratory depression, but she kept the words of his final moments to herself, guarding them like a dark treasure. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the slaughter in Normandy reached its terrifying climax in the Falaise Pocket, where the remnants of the German 7th Army were being systematically ground into the dust by Allied air power and artillery. Sarah was assigned to a forward surgical team following the armor as it broke out of the hedgerows and raced toward the Seine. The carnage she witnessed was on a scale that defied human comprehension, as the roads became choked with the burned-out husks of Panther tanks and the bloated carcasses of thousands of horses. The technical efficiency of the slaughter was a testament to the industrial power of the United States, as the T-3 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons rained down 500-pound bombs and rockets on the retreating columns. Sarah worked in a series of canvas tents where the floor was a river of blood, and the sound of the saw on bone was a constant background hum. She saw the results of the very weapons she had heard in the distance, and she realized that the war was a machine that consumed meat and turned it into statistics. Her act in the cellar was a microcosm of this greater destruction, a single needle in a sea of bayonets. The climax of the campaign near the town of Argentan was a whirlwind of fire and steel, where the lines between the front and the rear completely dissolved. Sarah's medical unit found itself in the path of a desperate German breakout attempt as the SS divisions tried to claw their way out of the pocket before the trap snapped shut. The slaughter was not confined to the combatants, but spilled over into the aid stations, where the wounded were targeted by desperate men with nothing left to lose. In the middle of a moonless night, the screaming of the Nebelwerfer rockets signaled the start of the final German push, and Sarah found herself once again reaching for the tools of her trade not to save, but to survive. The field hospital was illuminated by the orange glow of burning fuel trucks as the SS grenadiers charged through the perimeter, their bayonets gleaming in the firelight. This was the moment where the lessons of the farmhouse were applied on a broader scale, as Sarah and the other medics fought with a ferocity that surprised even the infantrymen. They were the guardians of the fallen, and they defended their charges with the desperation of mothers protecting their young. During the height of the engagement, a group of wounded Germans was brought into the triage area, their uniforms scorched and their bodies broken by the relentless shelling. Among them was a young corporal, whose eyes reminded Sarah of the boys she had grown up with in Ohio, but whose belt buckle still carried the motto of the SS. She looked at the surgical instruments laid out on the tray, the scalpels and the hemostats, and she felt the weight of the choice she had made weeks before. The slaughter was happening all around her, as the tanks traded shells at point-blank range, and the air was filled with the screaming of the dying. She understood that in the grand architecture of the war, her individual actions were like grains of sand. But she also knew that the moral fabric of the world was built from those very grains. She performed the surgeries with a cold and detached efficiency, ignoring the chaos outside, as she worked to repair the damage that her own countrymen had inflicted. It was a surreal and haunting cycle of destruction and reconstruction, where the same hands that could administer a lethal dose were now stitching together the enemies of her nation. The aftermath of the battle for Normandy left a scar on the landscape, and the soul that would take generations to heal. As the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and the true horrors of the concentration camps were revealed, the significance of Sarah's act in the farmhouse took on a new and even darker meaning. She realized that the Sturmbannführer she had killed was not just a lone antagonist, but a representative of a system that had turned the entire continent into a factory of death. The ghost of the officer haunted her dreams, not with accusations of murder, but with the memory of his arrogance and the cold realization of how close she had come to losing her own humanity in the process of destroying his. She moved through the ruins of Germany as the war came to a close, seeing the shattered cities of Cologne and Berlin, where the architecture of 1,000 years had been reduced to mountains of rubble. The technical achievement of the Allied victory was a triumph of logistics and engineering. But for Sarah, it was a long and weary road, marked by the ghosts of those she could not save. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, Sarah Miller returned to a United States that was celebrating a victory she felt she could only partially claim. She moved back to her small town and tried to resume the life of a civilian nurse, but the quiet of the suburbs was often interrupted by the phantom sounds of the 88mm guns. She never spoke of the farmhouse or the lethal dose to the neighbors who asked about her service. Instead, she gave them the sanitized version of the war that they wanted to hear. She was a ghost, walking among the living, carrying a secret that was as heavy as the stone walls of the cellar in Normandy. The official records mentioned her commendations for bravery under fire and her tireless work in the field hospitals, but the true story of her most significant contribution to the war effort remained unwritten. She had stood in the abyss, and she had refused to be broken, and in doing so, she had become a silent guardian of a truth that the world was not yet ready to hear. The ghost of the war followed her into her old age as she watched the world change, and the memories of 1944 began to fade from the collective consciousness. She saw the rise of new conflicts and the development of even more terrifying weapons of mass destruction. And she realized that the cycle of the slaughter was a fundamental part of the human condition. Her act of defiance in the farmhouse was a small and solitary strike against the darkness, a reminder that even in the middle of a total war, the individual still had the power to choose their path. She had given the Sturmbannführer exactly what he had asked for, but she had delivered it on her own terms and with a precision that he could never have understood. As she reached the end of her own long life, she looked at her hands, which were now wrinkled and spotted with age, and she saw the steady fingers of the young woman who had held the syringe in the damp cellar. The legacy of Sarah Miller is not found in the monuments of bronze or the history books of the great generals, but in the silent spaces of the heart where the true battles are fought. She was a soldier in a uniform she never asked to wear, and an executioner in a role she never sought to fill. Her story is a testament to the fact that the most powerful weapons are not always the ones that make the loudest noise, but are often the ones that are administered with a whisper and a steady hand. The ghost of the farmhouse remains a part of the landscape of Normandy, a lingering echo of a night when a nurse became a warrior and a conqueror became a casualty of his own pride. The lethal dose was a final and absolute answer to a question of dignity, and in the end, it was the only medicine that could truly cure the sickness that had infected the world in the dark years of the 1940s. The rain still falls on the hedgerows of France, washing away the traces of the blood and the cordite, but the memory of the woman who fought back will always remain hidden in the shadows of the bocage.